The early morning sun cast a golden glow over Riverside Heights, a suburban neighborhood just outside Richmond, Virginia, where life moved peacefully. The perfectly manicured lawns and white picket fences painted a picture of tranquility, but that image was about to be shattered. Nancy Caldwell, a 43-year-old housewife, was found dead in her home, in what would become one of the most shocking events the community had ever witnessed. It began when Jeff Caldwell, her husband, returned home from a business trip to Chicago. He had arrived earlier than expected, hoping to surprise his wife with breakfast. As his car pulled into the driveway, something unusual caught his eye. The front door was slightly ajar. In this quiet neighborhood, where doors were often left unlocked out of habit, the sight of the door left open felt immediately wrong. Stepping into the house, and Jeff was greeted with an eerie silence. There were no signs of life, no familiar sounds of Nancy moving about the kitchen or the soft hum of the coffee maker. The stillness in the air felt suffocating as his unease grew. The house, usually warm and inviting, now felt cold and hollow. As he moved further into the home, dread began to settle in. His heart pounded in his chest as he walked toward the living room, where his worst fears were realized. There, on the floor, lay Nancy Caldwell, lifeless in a pool of blood. Her body was motionless, her once vibrant brown hair now matted with thick blood. The once pristine cream-colored carpet was stained with dark red, and the shattered remnants of a crystal vase lay scattered across the room. Blood splatter painted the walls, telling a grim story of a violent struggle. Nancy had been beaten with the vase, the murder weapon still lying near her, shards of glass glistening in the morning light. Jeff stood frozen in place, unable to process what he was seeing. His wife, the mother of their children, had been brutally murdered in their own home. He collapsed beside her, his hands trembling as he touched her cold skin, knowing deep down that she was gone. Shock coursed through his body as he finally fumbled for his phone, calling for help. When the police arrived, Officer Rachel Morgan was the first to enter the scene. The sight that greeted her was one of chaos and brutality. The room bore all the signs of a violent altercation, and the sheer amount of blood told her that this was no accidental death. Quickly securing the scene, she ensured no one else would enter before the forensic team could arrive. Jeff was led outside, his clothes stained with blood, his eyes blank and unfocused as he sat on the front steps. He stared into the distance, trying to comprehend the horror he had just witnessed. The small, close-knit community of Riverside Heights had begun to stir. Neighbors, now alerted to the commotion, gathered in small groups, exchanging whispers about what could have happened. As the investigation began, Detective William Harper, a seasoned investigator with years of experience, arrived to take control. Surveying the crime scene, he immediately noticed the brutality of the attack. Blood was splattered across the walls and floors, and the broken vase near Nancy's body told a clear story of violence and rage. But one detail stood out to him above all else. There were no signs of forced entry. Nancy had let her killer in, and that was the first clue Harper knew he had to follow. The forensic team meticulously photographed the scene, taking care to document every detail. They collected blood samples, fibers, and fragments from the shattered vase. As they worked, Harper's mind raced, piecing together what little he had seen. This was no random attack. It was personal, and it was filled with fury. Nancy had known her attacker, and they had killed her in a moment of explosive rage. Outside, Jeff Caldwell sat silently, lost in his grief. His alibi seemed solid. He had been away on business, and his flight records would back up his claim. But Harper knew from experience that the investigation couldn't stop there. He needed to understand the dynamics of Nancy's life and the relationships she had cultivated. In communities like Riverside Heights, secrets often lay buried beneath the surface, hidden behind the perfect facades of suburban homes. As the forensic team continued their work, Harper turned his attention back to Jeff. The grieving husband seemed genuine in his shock and disbelief, but Harper's instincts told him there was more to the story. Jeff had mentioned no trouble between them, nothing to suggest that Nancy had been in any danger. But as Harper knew all too well, appearances could be deceiving, and it was often the ones closest to the victim who held the keys to the mystery. Nancy Caldwell's life, and now her death, had become the center of an unfolding investigation that Harper knew would lead them into the darkest corners of the seemingly perfect suburban world. The attack was savage, personal, and emotional. Whoever killed her had not done so on a whim. It had been driven by something deeper. The forensic team's luminol test revealed more traces of blood, leading toward the kitchen, suggesting that Nancy may have tried to flee before being struck down. Harper knew that whoever committed this crime had to be close to Nancy, close enough to have earned her trust, and close enough to harbor such rage. His mind raced through the possibilities. A jealous lover, a friend with a grudge, or even a family member. The neighbors outside, once peaceful and calm, now stood in anxious clusters, the quiet morning shattered by the grim discovery. Harper knew they would soon be whispering rumors about what had happened inside the Caldwell home, and those whispers might hold crucial clues. He would need to speak to them all, one by one, to uncover anything they might know about Nancy's life in the days leading up to her death. The investigation was only beginning, and Harper was determined to get to the bottom of it. The pristine, perfect world of Riverside Heights had been torn apart, and the secrets that had once been carefully hidden behind closed doors would soon come spilling out. Nancy Caldwell's death would be the key to unlocking a truth that no one in the community was prepared to face. The aftermath of Nancy Caldwell's death sent shockwaves through Riverside Heights, a once peaceful and unremarkable suburban neighborhood. What had appeared to be a close-knit community of trust and friendliness was now consumed by suspicion, fear, and whispers of secrets no one had ever imagined. While Detective William Harper methodically began his investigation, it became clear that uncovering the truth behind Nancy's murder would require peeling back the layers of her seemingly perfect life. The initial forensics report confirmed what Harper had already suspected. Nancy had been attacked with a brutal and singular force. The crystal vase from the mantelpiece used as the murder weapon, but the cause of death was more complicated than a single strike. The autopsy revealed multiple blunt force trauma injuries, suggesting not only that Nancy had struggled, but that her attacker had struck her repeatedly in a blind rage. Whoever had killed Nancy had been overcome by intense emotion, an outburst of anger or jealousy that led to her untimely death. Harper knew that crimes of passion were often committed by those closest to the victim, and as the investigation progressed, this theory only gained more weight. Jeff Caldwell, though visibly distraught, remained an important figure in the early stages of the inquiry. Despite his alibi, confirmed by flight records and colleagues, it was impossible to fully rule out the involvement of a grieving husband until every angle had been explored. Harper found Jeff's grief genuine, but his years of experience had taught him that appearances could be deceiving. But it wasn't Jeff's alibi that raised Harper's suspicions. It was the absence of something. Nancy had lived in Riverside Heights for over a decade, involved in church activities and social events, but there was no trace of any close friendships or emotional confidants. The interviews with neighbors and acquaintances painted a picture of Nancy as a woman who was kind, polite, but oddly isolated. Her involvement in the community seemed almost superficial, like she was playing a role rather than truly being part of the fabric of neighborhood life. This led Harper to one simple question: who did Nancy really trust? As Harper's team continued to comb through the Caldwell house, they found small signs that Nancy had been hiding something beneath the surface. Her bedroom was impeccably neat, except for one unusual detail: a drawer that had been locked. When the team forced it open, they uncovered a hidden journal. This journal, more than anything else, became the focal point of Harper's growing theory that Nancy's life wasn't as serene as it appeared. The journal revealed Nancy's innermost thoughts, a tangled web of emotions she hadn't shared with anyone. Written in neat, deliberate handwriting, the entries told a story of frustration, longing, and disillusionment with her marriage. It became clear that Nancy had felt trapped, not just by the responsibilities of her role as a housewife, but by a marriage that had long since lost its warmth. In one entry, she described Jeff Caldwell as distant, always working, and how she had felt abandoned by his preoccupation with his job. There were hints that she craved attention and excitement, but it wasn't until the later entries that Harper realized how far her need for affection had driven her. Nancy had met someone. She hadn't named him directly in her journal, but her words described a relationship that was more than just emotional. She had found comfort in someone much younger, someone who had reignited a passion she hadn't felt in years. Harper's suspicions grew as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. This was more than just a quiet affair. The way she described him, his energy, his adoration, it became clear that Nancy had developed an attachment far deeper than she had anticipated. The journal also spoke of fear, particularly in the final entries. Nancy had written about her growing concern over her lover's possessiveness, about how he had started showing up unannounced at her house, demanding her time. This detail sent alarm bells ringing in Harper's mind. He knew from years of experience that obsessive behavior, especially in the context of an affair, could easily escalate into violence. And it was precisely that escalation that Harper feared had led to Nancy's murder. Harper's next step was clear. He had to find out who Nancy had been involved with. Through further questioning of the neighbors, it didn't take long for Harper's attention to land on Jacob Davis, the 18-year-old son of Nancy's neighbors, Karen and Robert Davis. Jacob had been seen at the Caldwell house numerous times over the past few months. often helping Nancy with odd jobs around the house. Initially, no one had thought anything of it. Jacob was known to be helpful, polite, and friendly, traits that made him a well-liked young man in the community. But in light of the revelations in Nancy's journal, Jacob's frequent visits took on a far more sinister tone. Harper brought Jacob in for questioning. Although the young man seemed nervous, his responses were measured, and his outward demeanor didn't immediately raise any red flags. He denied any involvement in the murder, claiming that his visits to Nancy's house were purely platonic, and that he had only been helping her with gardening and other household chores. He seemed shaken by the news of Nancy's death, but Harper sensed something beneath the surface. As Jacob spoke, Harper noted his nervous gestures, the fidgeting, the way his eyes darted to the door as if looking for an escape. His words seemed rehearsed, and while his alibi wasn't airtight, it also wasn't easily disproven. Harper's instincts told him that Jacob was holding something back, but without direct evidence, there was little he could do at that moment. However, Harper was not the type to give up easily. He ordered a more thorough search of the Davis household, focusing particularly on Jacob's room. What they found further deepened the mystery. Hidden among Jacob's belongings were intimate letters from Nancy, further confirming the affair. These letters, unlike the entries in Nancy's journal, were written with the kind of raw emotion that painted a much clearer picture of the relationship. They described secret meetings, shared moments of passion, but also hinted at a darker side of Jacob's personality, a possessive streak that had started to scare Nancy. In one letter, Nancy had written, "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. You've changed, and I'm scared of what you'll do if I end things." This letter, dated just 2 days before her murder, was the most damning piece of evidence Harper had found so far. The investigation was now focused squarely on Jacob, but despite the mounting evidence, he continued to maintain his innocence. Harper knew the case was growing more complex by the minute. Jacob's connection to Nancy was undeniable, but the lack of physical evidence tying him directly to the crime scene was frustrating. The broken vest bore no usable fingerprints, and while the letters showed Nancy's fear of Jacob, they didn't prove he had killed her. The next breakthrough came when Karen Davis, Jacob's mother, was brought in for questioning. Harper had initially viewed her as a peripheral figure in the investigation, but as more information surfaced about Jacob's relationship with Nancy, he began to suspect that Karen knew more than she was letting on. Karen, who had always been protective of her son, seemed unusually anxious during the interview. She claimed that she had no knowledge of the affair, but her eyes betrayed her when Harper pushed her on the details. It became clear that Karen had, at the very least, suspected something was going on between her son and Nancy. She admitted to hearing Jacob talking to someone late at night, but she had dismissed it at the time, choosing not to confront him out of fear of what she might uncover. Her silence had, in some ways, enabled the dangerous relationship to continue. Despite the mounting pressure, Jacob continued to deny his involvement in the murder, but Harper knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. The letters, the journal, and the pattern of behavior all pointed to a dangerous escalation of events, one that had likely culminated in Nancy's violent death. As the investigation pressed on, Harper found himself faced with more questions than answers. Who else might have known about the affair? Was Jacob acting alone, or had someone else played a part in covering up the crime? And most pressing of all, what would it take to make Jacob crack and reveal the truth? The walls were closing in, but the case was far from over. Harper sensed that a final piece of the puzzle was still missing, something that would tie everything together and bring Nancy Caldwell's killer to justice. But in a community built on secrets, finding that missing piece would be far more difficult than he had imagined. The investigation into Nancy Caldwell's murder was beginning to feel like a labyrinth for Detective William Harper. With each layer of Nancy's life that was peeled back, more secrets and lies emerged. Despite the mounting evidence that pointed to Jacob Davis, the 18-year-old neighbor and secret lover, something about the case still didn't sit right with Harper. There was a missing link, a final piece that would tie everything together and expose the full truth. And until he found it, Nancy's murder remained an open wound in the heart of Riverside Heights. Harper's office was cluttered with photographs, evidence reports, and notes scattered across his desk. The letters from Nancy to Jacob were there, alongside crime scene photos, and the autopsy report that still haunted him. Every night, he would go over the evidence again, looking for something they might have missed. The journal entries, the letters, and the intimate details of their affair painted a clear picture of an unstable relationship, a one that had spiraled out of control, but something deeper gnawed at him. There were too many unanswered questions. The day after Karen Davis's unsettling interview, Harper decided to take a closer look at Jacob's movements in the days leading up to the murder. If Jacob had been obsessed with Nancy, It was possible that his behavior had become more erratic, more noticeable to those around him. Harper ordered his team to track down anyone who might have had contact with Jacob in those crucial days before Nancy's death. Friends, co-workers, anyone who could provide insight into his mental state. While waiting for those leads to come in, Harper revisited the forensic evidence. The team had collected blood samples, fibers, and the broken pieces of the crystal vase. But nothing had yet linked Jacob directly to the murder. There were no clear fingerprints, and the crime scene had been disturbingly clean, despite the violent nature of the attack. This detail gnawed at Harper's mind. How could such a brutal crime leave so little evidence? That's when Harper remembered something that had bothered him since the beginning: the vase. A heavy ornamental piece. It seemed like an impulsive choice for a murder weapon. But what if it wasn't? What if it had been premeditated? Harper needed to know if there was any history with that vase. Had it been moved recently, or was there something significant about it? He assigned a forensic specialist to re-examine the shards for any overlooked details. Meanwhile, the investigation into Jacob's recent activities began to bear fruit. Harper's team found that Jacob had become increasingly withdrawn in the weeks leading up to the murder. A former classmate reported seeing him at odd hours of the night, wandering the streets of Riverside Heights, as if searching for something or someone. Jacob's behavior, once charming and friendly, had shifted toward darker, more erratic tendencies. He had distanced himself from his friends and had been spotted lingering around Nancy's house even when she wasn't home. The deeper they dug, the more it became clear that Jacob's obsession had spiraled out of control. But Harper was still cautious. Obsessive behavior didn't necessarily mean murder. What they needed was something that could tie Jacob directly to the crime, and Harper wasn't ready to make an arrest until they had it. Days passed without significant breakthroughs, but Harper's persistence finally paid off when Officer Rachel Morgan brought him new information from an unexpected source. Leah Michaels, a retired woman who lived down the street from the Caldwells, had called in, claiming she had seen something suspicious the night before Nancy's murder. Leah had initially dismissed it, thinking it was nothing, but as the news of the affair spread through the neighborhood, her memory sharpened. Harper met Leah in her small, neat house. She seemed nervous, her hands fidgeting with a teacup as she spoke. Leah mentioned that on the night before Nancy was killed, she had been unable to sleep and had spent some time by her window, which gave her a view of the street. At around midnight, she saw Jacob Davis walking toward the Caldwell house. But it wasn't just Jacob. He wasn't alone. A second figure, whom Leah couldn't clearly identify, had been with him. This revelation hit Harper like a lightning bolt. Could someone else have been involved in Nancy's death? Leah couldn't provide much detail. She hadn't recognized the second person and assumed it was just another neighbor. But her account raised new questions. If there had been someone else with Jacob that night, who were they? And why hadn't they come forward? Harper knew they needed to move quickly. He ordered a review of all surveillance footage from around the neighborhood, hoping to catch a glimpse of the second person. It wasn't much to go on, but Harper's gut told him this lead was crucial. As the team worked to identify the mysterious figure, Harper turned his attention back to Karen Davis. Something about her earlier interview had felt off, and with Leah's testimony, Harper suspected she might know more than she was letting on. It wasn't uncommon for parents to protect their children, even when they knew they were guilty. But how far would Karen go to shield Jacob from the consequences of his actions? Harper had Karen brought in for a second interview. This time, as she seemed more on edge, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Harper's questions were direct and relentless, pushing her to explain what she knew about Jacob's whereabouts the night of Nancy's murder. Karen hesitated, and Harper knew he was getting close. Her protectiveness over Jacob was palpable, but it was also her downfall. Under pressure, Karen's facade cracked. She admitted to knowing about the affair weeks before Nancy's death. She had discovered it accidentally, finding a series of messages on Jacob's phone that revealed the depth of his relationship with Nancy. Karen had confronted Jacob, but he had begged her to keep quiet, insisting that he could handle the situation. Karen had reluctantly agreed, hoping it would all blow over. But as the affair continued, she grew more fearful of what might happen. She had even followed Jacob to Nancy's house the night before the murder, worried that his obsession might take a dangerous turn. It all started to make sense. Karen had been the second figure Leah had seen that night. She hadn't been involved in the murder, but her presence raised new questions about what she might have witnessed. Had Karen seen the attack? Had she been too frightened or ashamed to come forward? Harper pressed further, but Karen refused to admit anything more. Still, her involvement was enough to push the investigation forward. Harper now had confirmation that Jacob had been at Nancy's house the night before she was killed, and Karen's account placed him in a volatile state of mind. As the pressure mounted, Harper's team uncovered another piece of crucial evidence. One of the forensic analysts had re-examined the shards of the crystal vase and found tiny traces of fingerprints. Not enough for a full match, but enough to suggest that someone had tried to clean the vase after the attack. The incomplete print, however, matched Jacob's partial prints found elsewhere in the house, providing the physical evidence Harper had been waiting for. With the new evidence in hand, Harper knew it was time to confront Jacob again. This time, he wouldn't be able to hide behind his mother's protection. The noose was tightening around him, and there was nowhere left to run. The investigation into Nancy Caldwell's murder was reaching a critical point. Detective William Harper now had key evidence that placed Jacob Davis at the scene of the crime on the night of the murder, along with a partial fingerprint from the shattered vase. But the case was far from over. There were still gaps in the timeline, and the disturbing possibility that someone else had been involved that night kept nagging at Harper. Harper knew that Jacob's days of evasion were numbered. The mounting evidence against him, combined with his erratic behavior, had already drawn the attention of his neighbors, and the once charming boy next door was now the subject of murmured gossip in Riverside Heights. But Harper couldn't afford to act on rumors. He needed to continue building a watertight case before making his final move. As Harper prepared to bring Jacob in for further questioning, his team combed through phone records, social media interactions, and any surveillance footage they could find. They were searching for any connection between Jacob and the second person seen by Leah Michaels the night before the murder. While Karen Davis had admitted to following her son to Nancy's house out of fear, there was still the unsettling feeling that another figure might have been involved, or at the very least, witnessed the crime. Meanwhile, Harper continued to piece together the psychological profile of Jacob, who, over time, had descended from a well-mannered young man into someone dangerously consumed by obsession. Jacob's school records showed no prior history of violent behavior, but several former classmates mentioned in interviews that Jacob had grown increasingly isolated during his final year of high school. His relationship with Nancy, which had once been a source of excitement for him, had morphed into a dangerous fixation. Nancy's attempts to end the affair had clearly triggered something dark within Jacob, but Harper still couldn't figure out whether Jacob had planned the murder, or if it had been a crime of passion. The forensic team worked tirelessly, cross-referencing the fingerprint on the vase with all known associates of the Davis family, but the partial print remained inconclusive. It was Jacob's, but no one else's. Harper felt the weight of the case pressing down on him. With the fingerprint evidence being incomplete, he needed a confession, or something undeniable, that tied Jacob to the crime, in a way no one could refute. As Harper prepared for his next move, he took a risk. He ordered Karen Davis to come in again, not for questioning, but to rattle her. He knew that Karen's loyalty to her son was unwavering, but her fear was beginning to surface. Harper figured that by subtly applying pressure, he might force her into slipping up. He didn't need her to confess to anything. He just needed her to confirm, either directly or indirectly, that Jacob was guilty. The day Karen arrived at the station, Harper had a plan in place. He didn't take her into the usual interview room, but instead led her to a quieter, less formal setting in an attempt to catch her off guard. As they sat down, Harper laid out the evidence: Nancy's letters, the journal, and the partial fingerprint from the vase. He didn't accuse her of anything outright, but left the pieces on the table for Karen to see. Karen's face grew pale as Harper talked through the timeline of events, pausing deliberately at key moments to gauge her reactions. Her hands fidgeted nervously, and every so often, her eyes flickered toward the evidence on the table. She knew the implications. Harper could see it in her expression. She knew Jacob was in deep, but her maternal instincts still held her back from betraying her son. The silence that filled the room was thick with tension, and then, unexpectedly, Karen broke. I didn't know it had gotten this bad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I thought I could control him. I thought he would come to his senses." Her confession was enough for Harper. Karen hadn't been directly involved in the murder, but she had been aware of her son's deteriorating mental state. She had witnessed the warning signs and, in her denial, had let them slide until it was too late. Harper didn't press her further. He had what he needed, confirmation that Jacob's mental state had unraveled long before Nancy's death. It was one more layer in the complex web of guilt and regret that hung over the Davis family. With Karen's subtle admission, Harper now turned his full attention to Jacob. The young man had managed to evade a full confession up until now, but with the psychological pressure mounting, Harper believed that Jacob's walls were about to collapse. He called Jacob in for another round of questioning. This time, Harper wasn't holding back. He laid out the evidence in front of Jacob, every detail of his relationship with Nancy, the letters she had written, the fingerprint on the vests, and now Karen's tacit admission that she knew her son had been involved. But the most powerful tool Harper had was time. As he slowly spoke, methodically laying out the timeline of Nancy's final days, Jacob began to unravel. Sweat beaded on Jacob's forehead as Harper pushed him harder, exposing the growing chasm between Jacob's infatuation and Nancy's increasing fear. Harper spoke of Nancy's fear of him, how she had wanted to end things, and how Jacob had lost control when she rejected him. Jacob's body language became tense. His fists clenched as Harper described, in vivid detail, the struggle between him and Nancy on the night she died. Harper's words painted a clear picture of what had happened, how Jacob, consumed by jealousy and rage, had grabbed the vase and struck Nancy down when she refused to continue the affair. Harper kept his tone calm, but relentless, slowly tightening the emotional noose around Jacob's neck. The truth was there, just waiting to burst free. Finally, as Harper described the fatal blow that ended Nancy's life, Jacob's resolve broke. His body shook, and his eyes filled with tears. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Jacob finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "She was going to leave me. I couldn't let her go." Harper remained still, letting the weight of Jacob's confession settle into the room. Jacob's words were the admission they had been waiting for. The motive, the act, and the desperation that followed. It was all there, in Jacob's trembling voice and the anguished look in his eyes. Jacob continued, haltingly describing the events of that night. He had gone to Nancy's house, desperate to change her mind. But when she insisted on ending the relationship, something inside him snapped. The rejection, the fear of losing her, had pushed him over the edge. In a moment of blind fury, he had grabbed the vase and struck her. When Nancy collapsed, blood pouring from her head, Jacob panicked. He had tried to clean the scene, wiping down surfaces and attempting to cover his tracks. But the damage had already been done. As Jacob's confession ended, Harper knew they finally had everything they needed. The evidence, the motive, and now, the admission of guilt. It was all there. But there was still one lingering question in Harper's mind. Was Jacob truly alone that night? Leah Michaels had seen a second figure, and while Karen had confessed to following Jacob to Nancy's house, she had not admitted to witnessing the murder. Could it be possible that Karen had seen everything and had chosen to remain silent to protect her son? Harper would have to confront that possibility later. For now, Jacob's confession marked the closing of one chapter in the investigation. Nancy Caldwell's killer had been caught, but the full truth behind the events of that night remained just out of reach, shrouded in the shadows of Riverside Heights. With Jacob Davis's confession secured, the investigation seemed to be drawing to a close. But for Detective William Harper, the case still held too many unanswered questions. The full story had not yet emerged, while Jacob's admission of guilt filled in many of the gaps. The lingering presence of Karen Davis, the mother who had followed her son to Nancy Caldwell's house the night before the murder, remained a troubling enigma. Harper knew that she had seen more than she had let on. Jacob's confession had been one of desperation, a broken young man who had spiraled out of control. The forensic evidence, Nancy's letters, and the mounting witness testimonies had painted a clear picture of Jacob's mental state in the weeks leading up to the murder. His obsession had grown into something unmanageable, driven by jealousy and fear of abandonment. But what was missing from the confession, and what nagged at Harper, was the role Karen had played that night. Her presence outside the Caldwell house couldn't be a coincidence. As the days passed and the case began to make headlines across the local news, the community of Riverside Heights buzzed with whispered rumors and speculation. The once peaceful suburb had become a breeding ground for gossip, and the Davis family was at the center of it. Neighbors who had once smiled politely at Karen and her family now crossed the street to avoid them. Jacob's arrest had shattered any illusion of normalcy, and his mother's involvement, whether direct or indirect, was the focus of growing suspicion. Harper and his team knew they couldn't move forward without pressing Karen for the full truth. But there was something more urgent on the horizon: Jacob's trial. The legal proceedings were set to begin, and Harper had been working tirelessly to ensure that the evidence was airtight. Jacob's confession, along with the physical evidence and Nancy's letters, would provide the backbone of the prosecution's case. But Harper still feared that Karen's influence over her son and her refusal to admit what she had seen that night would complicate matters. In the quiet moments, Harper couldn't shake the sense that Karen had been a silent witness to the crime. Her protective nature, her willingness to shield Jacob from the consequences of his actions, made it impossible for Harper to believe she hadn't seen what had happened. The more Harper thought about it, the more he considered the possibility that Karen had been there during the murder. Her involvement might have been passive, watching from the shadows, too frightened to intervene. But it was an involvement nonetheless. The Davis house had become a fortress of isolation. Karen rarely left, and when she did, her movements were brief and cautious. Her world had shrunk, consumed by the knowledge of what Jacob had done and the consequences that now loomed. Harper knew that confronting Karen again could yield more answers, but the psychological toll of the last few weeks had clearly taken its toll on her. She was, in many ways, as broken as her son. The trial date approached, and Harper felt the weight of the unresolved details pressing down on him. While Jacob's guilt seemed certain, the defense team had begun to build a case around his mental state, aiming to reduce his culpability by highlighting his unstable psychological condition. The defense's strategy focused on portraying Jacob as a young man who had lost control due to emotional instability, brought on by the pressures of the illicit relationship and his deteriorating mental health. It wasn't an argument that Harper could easily dismiss. Jacob's behavior had clearly shifted in the months leading up to the murder, but the brutal nature of the crime demanded accountability. The trial itself was a spectacle. The courtroom was filled with members of the Riverside Heights community, eager to see justice served for Nancy Caldwell. Jeff Caldwell sat in silence, his grief palpable as the details of his wife's murder were laid out in front of him. The evidence was overwhelming, and Jacob's confession, though given under the weight of emotional breakdown, left little room for doubt about his role in Nancy's death. But as the trial progressed, the defense's focus on Jacob's mental state raised questions about the level of premeditation. Could Jacob have planned to kill Nancy, or was it truly a crime of passion, a tragic result of a young man's uncontrolled emotions? Harper watched as the defense painted Jacob as a victim of his own mental unraveling, someone who had been driven to an extreme he couldn't control. As the courtroom listened to the testimony of forensic experts and psychologists, Harper's thoughts kept drifting back to Karen. He couldn't ignore her part in this story, and her silence was deafening. The trial moved forward, but Harper's gut told him that the real story of what had happened that night still hadn't been fully uncovered. Days turned into weeks, and the trial neared its conclusion. The prosecution had done its job well, presenting the overwhelming evidence of Jacob's guilt, but Harper felt an unresolved tension. He had spent years solving cases like this, and every instinct told him that Karen had been more involved than she had admitted. One morning, as Harper sat reviewing his notes in the quiet of his office, a new piece of information surfaced that sent a chill down his spine. One of the forensic analysts had come forward with an overlooked detail, a partial footprint found in the garden outside Nancy's house, near the back entrance. The footprint wasn't Jacob's. It was too small. Harper immediately recognized its significance. Karen had been there, closer to the crime than anyone had realized. Harper's mind raced as he connected the dots. Karen hadn't just watched from a distance. She had been right there, just outside the house, when Jacob killed Nancy. Had she witnessed the entire event? Had she frozen in fear, unable to stop it? Or worse, had she allowed it to happen, knowing her son's destructive obsession? With this new evidence, Harper knew it was time to confront Karen one last time. Her silence had gone on long enough, and the truth, as buried as it had been, was finally coming to the surface. The trial might soon be over, but the full story of Nancy's murder hadn't yet been told. As Harper prepared to meet with Karen, he felt the weight of the investigation settle heavily on his shoulders. The truth, long concealed behind the walls of the Davis family's secrets, was finally coming into focus. And what he would learn from Karen would change everything he thought he knew about that fateful night. As the trial of Jacob Davis reached its climax, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Detective William Harper sat in the back, his thoughts consumed not by the closing arguments of the prosecution or defense, but by the final piece of evidence his team had uncovered, the partial footprint outside Nancy Caldwell's house. It had been Karen's. The discovery had shifted everything. She had been closer to the crime than Harper had previously suspected. She had been more than just a passive bystander to the events leading to Nancy's murder. Jacob's trial had brought many of the dark secrets of Riverside Heights into the light. What had once seemed like a clear-cut case of a young man's deadly obsession had become a story of buried guilt and a family torn apart by hidden truths. As the defense and prosecution presented their final statements, the jury deliberated over Jacob's fate. There was no question of his involvement. His confession had made that clear. But the question of his mental state and the possibility of reducing his sentence to a lesser charge weighed heavily. Harper, however, knew the trial wasn't the end. The truth of what had really happened that night still hadn't been fully revealed. He had requested one final meeting with Karen Davis, determined to confront her about the footprint and her presence at the crime scene. His instincts told him that Jacob's actions had been triggered not only by his own obsession, but by something deeper, something that Karen knew, but had refused to admit. That afternoon, Karen sat across from Harper in a small, dimly lit interrogation room, the weight of the investigation pressing down on her. She had aged considerably over the course of the trial, the stress etched deeply into her face. Harper could see the toll it had taken on her. Karen had been a mother trying to protect her son, but in doing so, she had unwittingly let events spiral out of control. Harper placed the photograph of the partial footprint on the table between them. No words were necessary. The meaning was clear. Karen's presence at the scene had been confirmed, and there was no longer any way for her to deny her involvement. The silence between them was heavy as Karen stared at the photo, her expression unreadable. In that moment, Karen finally broke. Not in an outburst of confession, but in a quiet, resigned acknowledgement of what she had witnessed that night. She had followed Jacob to Nancy's house, just as she had admitted before, but what she hadn't told Harper was that she had been there, just outside the window. When the argument between Nancy and Jacob had escalated, Karen had stood frozen as she watched her son and Nancy argue. She had seen the desperation in Jacob's eyes as he pleaded with Nancy not to leave him, to stay with him, despite the affair's destructive nature. And then, as Nancy refused, pushing Jacob away, Karen had seen her son snap. The vase, sitting innocuously on the mantel, had become a weapon in Jacob's hands. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't tried to stop it. Karen's guilt weighed heavier than Harper could have imagined. She had watched it all unfold. The moment Jacob's obsession turned into violence, the final blow that ended Nancy's life. But fear had kept her silent. Fear of what her son had done, and fear of what would happen if the truth came out. In the hours after the murder, Karen had done everything she could to protect Jacob. She had helped him clean the scene, wiping down surfaces, erasing the obvious traces of his presence. But the guilt remained, lurking just beneath the surface. Harper listened, piecing together the timeline of that night. Karen's confession, though painful, finally made sense of everything. Her actions weren't out of malice, but out of desperation. A mother trying to protect her child, even in the face of his monstrous actions. The truth had been buried, not just in Jacob's guilt, but in Karen's silence. And now, as the pieces of the puzzle came together, Harper saw the full picture. Jacob had been the one to strike Nancy down, but Karen had played a role in concealing the crime, in allowing the obsession to fester long before it turned deadly. Her inaction that night had contributed to the tragedy. She had seen what her son had become and had chosen not to intervene, hoping that it would all go away if she remained quiet. The trial's outcome was no longer Harper's primary concern. What mattered now was ensuring that the full story came to light, that Jacob, though mentally unstable, would face the consequences of his actions, and that Karen would finally be held accountable for her part in the cover-up. The revelation of her presence at the scene would shift the narrative in court, but Harper knew that justice, in its full sense, would be a complicated and painful process for everyone involved. In the following days, the prosecution incorporated Karen's admission into their case. Her failure to stop Jacob, her active participation in covering up the murder, became a point of contention, while Jacob's defense argued that his mental state had rendered him incapable of fully controlling his actions. Karen's role as an accessory to the crime cast a shadow over the family's legacy. As the jury returned its verdict, Jacob Davis was convicted of second-degree murder, acknowledging the crime's passion-driven nature, but still holding him accountable for Nancy Caldwell's death. The defense's argument regarding Jacob's unstable mental health had swayed the jury enough to avoid a first-degree murder conviction, but the sentence was severe. He would spend the next decades of his life behind bars, haunted by the obsession that had destroyed two families. Karen, meanwhile, faced her own legal consequences. Though she had not directly committed the murder, her role in covering up the crime led to charges of obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact. In the quiet courtroom, her plea of guilty marked the final chapter of a story that had torn apart the fabric of Riverside Heights. For the residents of the community, the trial's conclusion brought a mixture of relief and sorrow. Jeff Caldwell, who had lost his wife in such a violent and senseless way, remained quiet in the days following the verdict. The grief of losing Nancy, compounded by the knowledge that it had been at the hands of a boy they had trusted, was almost unbearable. For him, the legal proceedings had offered closure, but not healing. In the weeks that followed, Riverside Heights slowly began to return to normal. But the normalcy was fragile, haunted by the tragedy that had unfolded within its borders. The perfect image of suburban life had been shattered, and the residents knew that beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect world, dark secrets could fester. The whispers of what had happened would linger for years, a reminder that even in the most idyllic places, there were shadows. For Detective William Harper, the case of Nancy Caldwell's murder was one of the most complex of his career. It was not just a tale of obsession, betrayal, and murder, but of the silent complicity of those closest to the crime. It was a reminder that the truth could be twisted, hidden behind layers of guilt and love, and that justice, though served, often left scars. As Harper closed the file on the case, he knew that Riverside Heights would never be the same again, and neither would the Davis family, broken by the actions of a son consumed by a forbidden love and a mother paralyzed by fear. The story had ended, but the echoes of the crime would continue to reverberate through the quiet streets, a reminder of the hidden dangers lurking beneath the surface of everyday life. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe to see the latest and most thrilling family crime stories.